All right, hello everyone. This is Matt Ricker at NC State University. I'm going to give a talk about impacts of sea level rise on coastal communities, and was expecting to be there today, but this morning our son had the flu-like symptoms, and so my wife also came down with the flu, and I'm going to be at home for most of the day, probably going to the pediatrician this afternoon. So kind of a bummer, but put together this presentation for this conference. Just want to share with you some of the things that we're doing related to soils, specifically in wetlands, agriculture, and on-site wastewater treatment here in North Carolina related to our coastal communities. And I think this will be of interest to many folks who work in the state in coastal areas. All right, so here we go. Just before getting into the presentation, there's a lot of acknowledgements here. So this is an overview of pretty much 4 years of coastal research that we've been doing here at NC State. And so that can happen without our collaborators, our graduate students, our technicians that have worked on these projects. And so there's a whole slew of people that I'm borrowing their data from various projects to tell a story about what we're looking at here in North Carolina and how we're trying to understand sea level rise and its impacts to our soil systems, environmental systems, and thinking about coastal resilience. So there's a number of folks here, graduate students, technicians, folks from the USDA and NRCS. So through our cooperative agreements with the USDA, we're actually able to leverage equipment that is highly specialized, including things like these airboats that have coring booms on them so that we can evaluate the effects of sea level rise on our coastal wetland areas that are generally inaccessible by any other means. So that's one of the kind of cool things about having these cooperative agreements, that we can utilize the specialized equipment that I'll talk about a little later. So funding for these projects were through USDA, NRCS, 3 cooperative agreements, mostly related to coastal blue carbon, which I'll talk about in a little while here, evaluating coastal wetlands for carbon storage and sequestration. We have private donated money that came through the university, NC State University, into the program Climate Adaptation through Agriculture and Soil Management, which is shorthand CASM. And if you're interested in that, there's a link here. And probably of most interest to this conference is our on-site wastewater resilience, and looking at what is going on in our coastal zone as far as sea level rise and the likely impacts to our already permitted on-site wastewater systems. And this is funded in part through the USDA multi-state project NE 2045, which is on-site wastewater treatment systems, assessing the impacts of soil variability and climate change on these systems. So over about 4 years, we've been doing research on coupled coastal systems in North Carolina. This is an overview of the major points that we're finding. This is just from Google Earth. This week I pulled up our sort of areas that we're studying. As you can see, most of our areas are clustered here in the Albemarle-Pamlico Sound estuary region, some work on the Outer Banks out here, and then down in Brunswick County, we're doing some research as well. So we have 5 funded coastal soil research projects that I just mentioned through those various funding streams. Mostly we started doing our work in wetlands, and so that's these blue circles here. And a lot of our research was centered around the National Blue Carbon Assessment, which is looking at soil carbon stored in our estuarine environments, both marshes, ghost forest, and then also our tidal fresh or microtidal fresh forested swamps and wetlands. So we've done a fair amount of work, and actually, as you'll see, the health of the wetlands is actually tied to things that you may care about more, like agriculture and our infrastructure, including septic systems. We've also begun a very large project, the CASM project, looking at salinization in agricultural fields. This is in Hyde County, down here near Lake Mattamuskeet, working in different farms, mineral soils mostly, that are experiencing or undergoing major salinization, and that's affecting crop production massively down in this area. And then we did some research with the NE 2045, where we've looked at geospatial predictions of sea level rise salinization soil types and permitted septic systems in 7 coastal counties, and that's our red stars here. So we have pretty good coverage actually in the state, especially in our Albemarle-Pamlico Sound area, 13 coastal counties total that we've already done research in. So I would like to introduce this coastal continuum concept because it is pretty important. So people tend to think of, if you're interested in septic systems or on-site wastewater treatment, you're thinking, the infrastructure level, you're thinking of these individual houses with permitted systems. However, it's really important to kind of think of this as an interconnected issue or a continuum of soil issues that are related to salinization, saltwater intrusion, and sea level rise. And so the open estuary and oceanic water, which is either brackish or oceanic water, is the source of many issues that we're dealing with, specifically soil issues and infrastructure issues on the coast. And one of the major problems that we're having is we have, in many cases, these wetland buffers, and these wetland buffers are protecting our infrastructure. They're also protecting our agricultural lands, are also protecting our forestry lands from things like storm surge, overland flow during large storm events, basically pushing salt water up into these systems. And so really, we need to think of these wetland buffers as critically important areas to maintain on the landscape in our fight against climate change, specifically sea level rise. So, a lot of our infrastructure is fixed. And so if you have a house here with a septic system, it is not moving, but the land is moving. And progressively, we're getting shoreline erosion that's cutting into our wetland buffer. And eventually, as that gets cut down, you lose your ability to sort of offset some of this saltwater intrusion through these native wetland systems, in this case, a marsh. And so it's critically important to consider when we're thinking of, urban engineering or ecosystem engineering, thinking about our wetland systems being tied to the health of our land use decisions. And so really you can think of this as a setback, your horizontal setback distance, let's say 50 feet from open water, is being shrunk or cut into by shoreline erosion as our marshes are submerging and we're having sea level rise. The other thing that's going on out here, and many of the folks that are at this conference know, groundwater is also rising. So the groundwater that's moving shallowly through these more upland areas into the marsh and then discharging out into the sound, in this case, is getting higher because the sea level is getting higher. And so that's pushing our groundwater higher. And so we're also losing our vertical separation distance at the bottom of many on-site permitted systems. And so the functionality of currently existing on-site wastewater treatment systems is becoming less and less effective. The other thing is, regardless of what's going on with the land use, agriculture, forestry, urban, suburban uses, septic systems, et cetera, saltwater intrusion leads to soil salinization, which really lowers our plant productivity. We know this just from visual assessment, in fields, but it also impacts on many of our microbial communities that specifically for this conference treat our on-site wastewater. And so, pulses of salt water not necessarily are going to destroy an on-site wastewater treatment system, but over time, chronically, you can change the microbial community and really degrade your ability to treat pathogens and get rid of your nitrate before sort of you get your discharge through the system to our open estuary system. So really protecting water quality into the future is going to become more challenging as soil salinization increases in these areas. So this is the way that I think of sort of our coastal systems as the interconnected systems. So our wetlands are critically important for protecting our infrastructure and our higher land uses on the coast. And this all comes into the idea of coastal resilience. And this is our ability to withstand sea level rise on the coast. It's planning, it's socioeconomics, it's using our natural resources to basically combat these issues that we know are going to be occurring over the next century or so. And so at NC State and North Carolina, and generally, why do we care about coastal soils? Well, coastal resiliency is a top priority. NC State University has a large university-wide initiative related to coastal resilience. On top of this, North Carolina has the 6th longest tidal coastline in the US, according to NOAA, And we have 1.2 million permanent residents in our coastal counties, many more visiting. So you can imagine that as sea level rise is increasing, we're losing land, we're losing productivity, we're losing our ability to sort of use these areas because of soil salinization. This is going to become major problems into the future. Currently, our coastal soils information is severely lacking because it wasn't a priority area. This wasn't a priority area when the soil maps were originally created in the 1980s for most of North Carolina. There were sort of throwaway lands. It was just, that's a marsh, that's a sandy soil. It wasn't really a priority. The priority was agricultural lands and working agricultural lands. So we have lacking information. So that's where I come in. I'm a soil scientist, and we're really trying to update the interpretations for predicting sort of land use in these coastal environments with the overarching theme of sea level rise. And I do this through the USDA NRCS with the Coastal Zone Soil Survey, which is actually anchored here in Raleigh, North Carolina. So it's been a very good partnership to get a lot of this work done. So here's us doing some evaluations in coastal wetlands, and then this is a very specialized offshore pontoon boat that you'll see a little later for evaluating underwater soils, or what's happening when land is actually being submerged. That's a big sort of question we have. So what are the sea level rise projections? So really, projections are dependent on scale, and so there's a bunch of different scales here. We have global scale, contiguous US scale, and then the southeastern United States scale. Really what you should take away from this is that the models, so here we have actual data that we've measured. This is all from NOAA. And these projections here are through 2050. So these are measured data, and then you see this diversion here, and you basically have high, intermediate, and low scenarios. And so these are modeling scenarios. They're basically not come to fruition yet, but really we want to focus on that intermediate, sort of that middle scenario. So it could be higher, it could be lower. Really, we usually focus on our intermediate scenarios as far as sea level rise. And what we're seeing, on all of our graphs, regardless of the scale, is an exponential increase by 2050. And so what this means is folks that are living on the coast and have lived there for a long time may not have seen a lot of sea level rise impacts, going through the 1980s, 90s, early 2000s. But now, as you're seeing, we're every year exponentially getting higher and higher impacts from sea level rise. And so it's kind of hard to ignore anymore. It's not going to be a slow process into the future. It's in all model cases, we're going to have accelerated sea level rise through 2050. Really, we need to key in here because we're in the southeast region, according to NOAA, and our intermediate by 2050 projections is 0.36 meters. It's about 15 inches. So 15 inches by 2050 of additional sea level rise from what we've already seen. And if you know about the geomorphology of the coast of North Carolina, we have very low-lying areas. Many of our highly productive agricultural lands are like 1 to 5 feet above sea level, so current sea level. So even by 2050, we're going to have major impacts. Likely to exceed 0.9 meters. This is about 3 feet. So many of the models that project out to 2100 are projecting about 3 feet of relative sea level rise. In addition, this report here by Sweet et al. 2022 also models the amount of, or the frequency of, nuisance flooding. So nuisance flooding or sunny day flooding is essentially you don't have a large coastal storm like a hurricane, which we always think of as storm surge. It's essentially a high tide event that, or in the estuaries, it's a wind-driven event that basically pushes shallow salt water up onto land where it shouldn't be. And this is just associated with regular high tides because of mean sea level coming up. And currently we're experiencing about 1 to 3 nuisance floods, depending on where you are in North Carolina. The projections by 2050 is exceeding 10 per year. So almost every month, the projections are saying that we're going to have chronic saltwater intrusion. This is these little 4 to 6 inch floods. They're going to inundate our infrastructure. They're going to inundate our farm fields. They're going to inundate our low-lying forestry areas. And chronically, that salt is going to continuously be added to the soil, and we're going to get major salinization problems. We're going to have up to 5 times more frequency of these minor floods. So it's not just hurricanes that are causing these problems. It's actually more of these nuisance floods. Every month you're going to get, more and more frequent flooding of salt water in these systems. So that's an important distinction. Most of our research has been conducted in the Albemarle-Pamlico Sound, which is here. This is a nice map by Riggs et al. From 2011. But it shows bathymetry, which is your sort of your underwater depths. So these are shallow environments. They're very easy with wind to pick up waves, and even with like 15-knot winds, you can get shallow inundation blowing in on land. Let's say around Engelhard, for example. So it doesn't take much in these systems. It's a wind-blown system primarily, and it's the second largest estuary system in the United States behind the Chesapeake Bay. The thing that makes this really an interesting area to work in is it's not semi-diurnal tides like you have out here on the Outer Banks and our other coastal areas. Those tides are actually cut off. And so our lunar tides are not allowed to fully enter the estuary system. They only saltwater inputs are through the inlets or the breaks in the Outer Banks. And so that's the Oregon Inlet, the Hatteras Inlet, and the Ocracoke Inlet here are pouring in our saltwater, whereas the freshwater push is coming down the river systems like the Chowan, the Roanoke, Tar River, Neuse River, etc. And so it's sort of this battle between fresh and salt water in it. And you can kind of think of it as a bathtub of brackish or salty water that's just sloshing around with the wind. And that's sort of how that works. The name of this process is seiche, and so it's wind-driven tides. So it's a highly unpredictable system, and it's a highly unique system in that it's a lagoon. It doesn't have really good tidal range. It may be 4 to 6 inches. That's your tidal range, as opposed to 3 to 6 foot tidal range, depending on where you are along the Atlantic itself in North Carolina. So it's a really complex system. It depends on wind and what wind direction and how fast that wind is, what your flooding or your risk for salinization is going to be. This is a drowned coastline, and again, the predictions are 30 centimeters-ish. It's about a foot, and 90 centimeters-ish, 3 feet by 2100. So these are the projections. This is a drowned coastline, so sea level rise has been occurring since the last glaciation. Naturally, just because of the melting of the glaciers, and the Outer Banks would have been situated out here at the continental shelf. So about 60 miles inland, these systems have moved since the last glaciation 20,000 years ago. So it's a complex system. So what does 1 foot and 3 feet of sea level rise look like? This is the NOAA Sea Level Projection Viewer. It's a handy tool to understand, especially if you're going to buy property or invest in an area. What's your risk of being inundated in the next, let's say, 100 years by salt water? So this is the current configuration of North Carolina coast. And if we project forward, this is 1 foot relative sea level rise. So all your light blues are areas that are predicted to be shallow inundation or basically submerged under shallow water. You can see a lot of this problem is in the Pamlico Albemarle Sound, also up the Cape Fear River here near Wilmington. And we'll project forward with 3 foot sea level rise. This is by 2100. And yeah, this is not good. This is essentially all of Hyde County, just the rim of Lake Mattamuskeet, huge swaths of Terrell County and Dare County out here are predicted to be inundated. So this is some of our most productive farmland in the state down here in our Tidewater region. And that is predicted to be underwater essentially by 2100 without massive engineering to sort of keep this area above water. With that is saltwater intrusion. As this is occurring, you're getting salinization, and there's also structures here. So something like, over 10,000, around 10,000 residents down in this area, they all have mostly septic systems permitted in these areas. So you can imagine the major environmental issues we're going to be dealing with over the next 100 years here in the state. So that's sort of the introduction. This is the parts of the presentation. So think of this as sort of a continuum of soils that help each other against sea level rise. And so this is Bird Island. This is a really interesting site down near Charlotte, North Carolina. This is right on the South Carolina border. Here's our large tidal creek wetland systems. Here's our outer beaches, and then here's our infrastructure along the intercoastal waterway. So this system here is a large buffer from the Atlantic Ocean that's protecting our inland systems. So 3 parts of the presentation. What are wetland buffers? How are they holding up? And what's the risk if they erode? So what would happen if these wetlands go away? That's a very important question in North Carolina. And then coastal agriculture. We're just starting to get into this realm of looking at agriculture on the coast, as it is such a big thing here in North Carolina. But what properties within the soil are correlated to salinization? And can we get some protocols to rapidly map and rapidly respond to storm surge events in the field? And then how many floods can these soils take? Is it 1 flood? Is it 2 floods? Is it 3 floods? Is it 10 floods? We're looking at more and more chronic salinization in these low-lying areas. How many times can you flood these soils? How resilient are these soils to saltwater intrusion? That's a big question that we have. And then what folks are probably most interested at this particular meeting, coastal septic systems. Also, we've been looking at spatial locations and risk with sea level rise. Are they going to be inundated? What types of soils are they in? Where should we be putting our research dollars in North Carolina to really get the most bang for the buck if we're going to look at in the field coastal septic systems? So I don't like to do anything blind. We don't just sort of go out and start perforating the landscape. It's a lot of work to get soils data. So we do work in the lab beforehand to really look at what types of soils should we be targeting in all of our studies. And so the first thing that we did here in North Carolina was what soil types are the most likely to go underwater with our sea level projections. Our 0.3 and our 0.9 meters, that's 2050, and this is 2100 in red. And so we basically took all of our soils for all of our 17 counties that have tidal influence or tidal shorelines, and we buffered off of that, and we looked at our sea level projections from NOAA. And so what you're seeing here is predicted land inundated. This is in hectares. It's about 2.5 acres. The big thing is in blue, this is by 2050. This is how much land or soils will be underwater or predicted to be underwater. The 0.91, that's how much land plus the blue is predicted to be underwater by 2100. And what you can see is histosols come out as the #1 soil type that's endangered in this state. And histosols are organic soils. And these are wetland soils. These are our marshes, our ghost forest, our different wetland buffers on the coast. These are low-lying areas. That's why they're super wet. And they are massively at risk for going underwater in the next 100 years or so. So this is why we started looking at histosols in North Carolina. This is our wetland buffer systems. Entisols, altisols, and zeptisols, alphasols, spotosols, all predicted to be going underwater as well. And these are where our agriculture infrastructure uses are. So these are wetland buffers protecting these soils behind there. But notice that entisols and altisols, as you'll see throughout this presentation, are extremely important. And these are the types of soils that we should be targeting for research moving forward if we're looking at septic systems or things like agriculture, forestry, et cetera. So that's the big thing there. This is why we've started looking at wetland buffers, because they're the most at risk for going underwater and being submerged. We've done a lot of work on this. I could talk for over an hour just about our wetland buffer research, but this is mostly funded by the USDA NRCS Coastal Zone Soil Survey. But we've taken an approach to look at not only what's going on land within our wetland buffers. So this is a wetland buffer here. We have our transition in green. This is our forested environment, and sort of this, I don't know, tan color. This is your marsh environment. And here's the Pamlico Sound, which is mapped as W, which is water. The interesting way that we've started to look at this is Habani soil series. So this is a soil map, HOA, that's Habani. And this is the soil here. This is a histosol, as I just mentioned. It's an organic soil. So we have basically these O horizons are organic material that's built up over the last 10,000 years. And it's very thick. It's like we've actually encountered organic soils that are 8 feet plus in depth out in these regions. We have a fair amount of organic material built up here. The interesting thing here is this yellow line is the line that in 1987, when the soil map was created, was the shore. So this yellow line here was the shore in 1987. And obviously this line right here is the shoreline from today with our aerial photos. And so we can actually calculate, the distance in between these points and understand how many meters or feet per year are we losing of shoreline into these wetland buffers. And this is critically important because these wetland buffers are not infinite, right? They have an end. So if you erode through this all the way back here and your houses are fixed, you're in trouble. You don't have a buffering system anymore from storm surge, and you're going to get salinization at your house. And that's never a good idea. Or that's not a thing that most homeowners would want, is salt marsh in your backyard, but I've actually seen that in parts of Hyde County. So there's permitted houses that are fixed in place, and with sealable rise, you basically have a marsh growing in your backyard right on top of your septic system. How functional that system is, I don't know. But here we've lost about 125 meters across this Habani unit on average, and that's 3.8 meters per year. It's over 10 feet. So over 10 feet of shoreline erosion per year. You can imagine with accelerated sealable rises, is just going to eat up these wetland buffers. So we've taken soil evaluations from what's currently above, above air right here, sort of our marsh system, and then we've looked at what we call subaqueous soils, or underwater environments. We've done this at 12 sites within the Pamlico and Albemarle Sound to date. Looks and sounds easy on paper. When you're looking at a map, it's critically important work, but it's extremely difficult to actually accomplish. If you've ever been in wetlands in North Carolina, they present a lot of challenges. This is Phragmites australis, invasive species, is 14 feet tall. You have to hack through that to get into your areas for sampling. And it's about 90 something degrees in the summer. Here's, the samples that we're taking, really organic type material. We're doing chemistry in the field. Here's black needle rush. If you ever walk through that, it stabs through your clothes. We also have sawgrass that'll cut you, and ghost forest. And then here's our freshwater swamp areas that are predicted to be inundated with saltwater into the future. These will become ghost forests eventually, and you get your alligators and cottonmouths in here. So very, very challenging environment to work in. This is just a video. I don't know if the sound will come through on the recording, but this is a video of us actually taking those underwater cores. So we'll do evaluations. In this case, this is the Alligator River in North Carolina. We're doing evaluations of the wetland buffer here, in this case, a ghost forest, and then we're looking at the soil properties just off from that. I don't know if the sound will come through or not, but I can narrate over this. This is me here and NRCS folks. We're putting an aluminum pipe up through a moon pool in the bottom of a specialized coring boat. And this is a concrete vibrator connected to the top. So it basically sonicates the pipe, and it basically liquefies the soil, and it'll send it right down. We call it vibrator. It's a very specialized piece of equipment, very heavy, requires special boats, and these boats are custom built. And we have a couple of these actually based here in Raleigh for doing this type of work. So obviously you need really specialized equipment to do this type of work. And we're very grateful for the assistance that we get from the USDA to do this. And that's about, I think, probably 9 foot core. And there we go. So then you basically hook the pipe up, you winch it out of the soil, and then you can cut that pipe and make a description of the soil just like you would on land. The big thing that we're finding is in these organic systems or histosols where our wetland buffers are, like up here with all these O horizons, this is a built up peat or organic material. It's essentially the second it goes underwater, it is gone. In all cases, if you're looking at our coastal wetland buffers, be it marsh or ghost forest, 94% of all organic materials that have built up on land are eroded and lost upon submergence. Now, how does that look? It looks like this. Here's the mean sea level. This is Swanquarter Bay. This is an example from marshes in Swanquarter. Here's your marsh system that's sitting up above the mean high water. And the second that it erodes, you lose about 3 foot, 108 centimeters is a little over 3 feet of that organic material. And you have just a little bit of that organic material remaining behind. And then over time, the wave action just beats up that organic material, disperses it, and physically erodes it. And so by the time you get offshore, about 50 to 75 meters, less than a football field, all that organic material is churned up and lost from the soil system. And here we have almost 6 feet. This is basically 6 feet of water once you get 50 feet off. This would have been marsh in the past. So the sea level rise is just eroding marsh and replacing it with water. And why do we get this deep 6-foot water? It's because all this organic material is dispersing. It doesn't hold up really well to submerged wave action. The reason being, the roots are critically important of the live vegetation to hold that material in place. Once the marsh goes underwater, it does not take long. Probably within 5 to 10 years, you're going to lose most of your organic material. This is a major issue environmentally. If you think about global climate change and you think about carbon accounting, things like, this is locked up atmospheric CO2, it's a major problem. But it's also a major problem in that you're just losing land, and that's your buffer, that's your setback for your other infrastructure behind. We also looked at peat thickness, or the thickness of organic material, going from our freshwater swamp systems in our coastal environments to our ghost forest. This is basically as saltwater intrusion occurs, the freshwater woody plants die back. This is an example of a ghost forest here. And then it transitions back to a stable marsh system. The big thing is, regardless of what coastal system you're going into, when you have saltwater intrusion going to a freshwater system, you lose peat. So the peat basically collapses in on itself, and then it becomes very susceptible to shoreline erosion or physical erosion. That's an example here. This is the Albemarle Sound. And you can see these trees way out, even on these points. This is probably 100 yards or so, a football field worth of inland shoreline erosion that's occurred over probably the last 50 years or so. So once the stable trees and their roots get killed by saltwater intrusion, you get peat collapse, and then you get inland erosion occurring pretty quickly. So why is this significant? Peat collapse is basically your elevation above sea level. So as the peat collapses, you're getting closer to sea level. You're not getting as much of a buffer. That storm surge can actually ride up over the top pretty easily when the peat collapses, and you lose. In this case, you're losing over 6 feet, maybe 1 to 6 feet of elevation you're actually losing. And then, so it's a vertical thing, and then it's also a horizontal thing. So you're also eroding back now and submerging these histosols. So these are major issues. We're losing our wetland buffer ability to block storm surge in many cases. And we see this all the way across North Carolina, Albemarle system, Pamlico system, all over the place. We're seeing the same trends over and over again. So the big take-home message here is, if you calculate loss, and so here's our wetland buffers. Let's think of our coastal systems as ghost forests and marsh. This is the average loss per year of shoreline. And here we're losing 0.65 or 1.6 meters per year, depending on if you're in a marsh or ghost forest. This is 2.5 feet to 6 feet of loss per year. So in our marsh systems, that's 44 meters by 2050 that we're going to lose from our marshes as far as setback distance between the water and the saltwater intrusion and whatever structures may be behind these wetland buffers. So that's 145 feet. So if your house is 200 feet, or 150 feet from the water today, by 2050, if you have a marsh in front of you, that water is going to be pretty close, and you're going to be exceeding your 50-foot buffer range for really good treatment with on-site wastewater. We're going to have water quality issues. So the big take-home message here is we're losing our wetland buffers, both vertically and on the landscape. They're retreating inland as sea level is rising. So this brings us to what's going on behind these wetland buffers. So we're losing our ability to keep up with sea level rise. We're losing our soil systems as soils are being submerged. And this is allowing more storm surge, more saltwater intrusion to occur through these systems into our areas that are protected behind there currently. So we're looking at salinization mostly in Hyde County, North Carolina. mostly because we're looking at agriculture, and this is one of our major agricultural producing areas in the state. And this is a picture from a drone. We're basically looking inland from the Pamlico Sound. So the source of salt is right behind the drone here. It's a wetland buffer that we're flying over, and this is a cornfield. So here's your cornfield, and you can see all this gray color. That's basically salt crust on the surface from successive events of saltwater intrusion coming up these ditches from the Pamlico Sound. And I would like to mention, here's 2 farmhouses right here. So if you're having major issues with saltwater intrusion in your fields here, you're probably going to get some major issues with your concrete, with your structure, and then also with your functionality of any permitted on-site wastewater system in this area. So it's not just plants that are affected, it's also the microbial community. And the other thing that salt does is it disperses clay, and so it really destroys soil structure. And so that structure is critical for getting any movement of water coming out in a drain field through the soil system. If you lose your structure, especially at the surface, you're going to create these layers that are impermeable to within your drain field that are impermeable. So your effectiveness of treatment of on-site waste is likely going down because of combined effects of microbial stress as well as our physical properties going away in the soil. So, how does saltwater intrusion affect all these different systems in a coastal environment? And that's sort of where we're going with our research. The first thing that we're starting to look at is how do we assess this? How do we assess crop loss? And some of the ways we're doing this is testing rapid methodologies. And so the idea is that we could equip our extension folks through cooperative extension with field kits or tools that could be used rapidly in response to like a large event, say a hurricane. So you can see here really bad growing conditions, but over here we actually have pretty decent, we have these little areas in these fields in the distance of saltwater intrusion. And so it's sort of this patchwork. So how do we, if we get storm surge over this road and up into here, how do we know what remediation steps it takes? So we're trying to get these rapid methodologies nailed out. First thing we're looking at is field kits, specifically looking at electrical conductivity. So an agent could come out here after a storm and sample the soil, and within 40 minutes have an answer as far as electrical conductivity. And that is what this graph here is depicting. So here is field 1 to 2 EC. You can basically take these samples in a little beaker, you can shake them up, you can put them on the tailgate of a truck for 30 minutes, and then you can use a portable EC meter that costs about $800, and you can get a number and put yourself on this graph. Here is the North Carolina Department of Agriculture. ESP is exchangeable sodium percentage, which is used as a way of predicting effects of salt on plants. When you exceed an ESP of 20, the idea is that 100% of your plants are going to be affected, plant growth. And so you can see here we've gone out and we've targeted areas that have low salt, high salt, really high salt, so we can get this nice graph. And what you can see is we have pretty good correlation between our field measurement in 40 minutes and what the NCDA will derive for the farmer, which could take weeks up to months, depending on the time of year that those soil samples are submitted to the state lab. So this is one of the major things that we're working on, is rapidly having folks out here responding to saltwater intrusion. The other one that we're starting to work on this fall is electromagnetic induction, EMI. This is a geophysical tool. You basically can drag it across the soil and it'll take readings of electrical conductivity without even having to make any physical measurements. It basically takes an electromagnetic pulse and it'll read electrical conductivity. And the cool thing there is you can just drag it behind a gator back and forth, and you can actually map salt. You can map salt in the surface, you can map salt in the subsurface of the soil. Extremely important for farmers that are experiencing these huge crop losses like this, that they know where that salt is and what remediation may be possible for them in that soil. Other things that we're doing in this realm, laboratory manipulation. So in the field, we have all these different sites. One of the things that we're looking at is how resilient are our coastal soils to chronic saltwater flooding. So NOAA is projecting greater than 10 nuisance floods per year by 2050. Currently, we're only experiencing 1 to 3. So with, let's say, almost 5 times higher frequency of nuisance flooding, we're going to get chronic saltwater intrusion in these systems. And what's that going to look like? How many floods before that soil microbially is changed forever and not as functional as it should be? And also how much sodium is getting held on these soils that's going to affect plant growth, for example. And so we're doing laboratory manipulations. We're taking freshwater soils that are currently freshwater, and we're actually adding saltwater from the Pamlico Sound to these different columns. So these are sealed columns, and we're measuring a suite of information. So real time, we're measuring greenhouse gas production like carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane coming off of these systems. We're looking at the soil chemistry. So what was the soil chemistry before we flooded? What was the soil chemistry after we flooded once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, etc. And then we're also monitoring the microbial community. So what is the microbial community like before we did this chronic experiment? And what is the microbial community and function afterwards? This is not just critical for agriculture. So these original, what we call mesocosms, are for agricultural lands and purposes. We can use the exact same technology here to assess permitted septic system drain fields. And so we can look at the microbial community, structure and function over time with basically chronically saltwater intruding on these permitted systems on really common soils on the coast of North Carolina. So we're actually in the process of probably collecting some drain field samples to manipulate in the lab, similar to what we're doing already with our agricultural soils in the next year. So that brings me to the last thing. What have we actually done with septic systems and our on-site waste systems and thinking about those in North Carolina? So through the NE 2045 project, we have a small budget to do research every year. It's not enough to hire like a full-time student, and so I use some of that money to subsidize a non-thesis master's student through NC State, Sarah Jordan, graduated in 2020 actually. And what we looked at was a remote, this was during COVID as well, so it was very difficult to get in the field. So we looked remotely at different ways of assessing the vulnerability of septic systems in the state to sea level rise. So we had 7 partners in coastal counties provide us with GIS data, and these are the 7 counties. So we have Currituck, Camden, Pasquotank, Perquimans, Chowan, Bertie, and Brunswick County provided us data in GIS. Not all counties have GIS data, which basically is a location of a permitted septic system. For example, Hyde County, that is all paper. So not all of our counties have availability of data, and so we went with the 7 that we could get data from. Looking at the data, we had over 30,000 permitted septic systems that are currently operating that were defined as being at risk within the coastal zone within 500 meters, basically, of tidal influence today. So there's significantly more systems. I think it was over 60,000, but many of those weren't in direct danger of becoming inundated with saltwater intrusion in the near future. So we basically picked these 30,000 that were within 500 meters of the current coastline. We joined this with Surgo, which is our soil survey data, so we could understand these permitted system locations, what type of soil were they permitted into. Then we used the NCDQ shoreline buffer. So we used the actual shoreline from today, from the NCDQ, and we buffered it by 50 feet for setback distances that should be adhered to for most of our coastal septic systems for effective treatment and protection of water quality. And then we compared these system locations and soil types to our predictions by 2050 of 1 foot and 2100 of 3 foot of sea level rise in this region from NOAA. So basically we layered all these different information, septic systems, soil types, and where's the current shoreline and where's the shoreline going to be by 2050 and where's the shoreline going to be by 2100. And so these are the data that we came back with on this analysis. So looking at sea level risk to our on-site systems that are already in the ground and permitted, already it was kind of interesting. This is likely because we're talking about that shoreline erosion. We're losing setback distance. So if you were permitted in the 1970s to have a septic system and you were like 150, 200 feet from the shore, we're having shoreline erosion at massive rates. And so in many cases, it looks like, or it would seem from the GIS data, that we have a lot of systems that are already encroaching or within that 50-foot setback from shore. So 328 permitted systems that are currently operating are within these 7 counties or within 50 feet of the current shoreline. Most of these are in Currituck County. So you'll see Currituck is would be a priority area for actual on-the-ground research, 54%. With the NOAA projections, which is down here, sea level rise projections, this is the number of systems with 1, 2, and 3 foot of sea level rise that would be inundated. So essentially, these are septic systems that are in the ground right now, operating, that by 2100, let's say, would be underwater or shallowly inundated and not functional anymore. 118 total systems in these 7 counties are projected to be inundated completely with sea level rise by 2100. Again, most are in Currituck County. So of the 7 counties, really, where should we focus effort or at most risk of these counties? Probably Currituck, because they have the most risk. They already have systems that are within the 50-foot buffer setback. They already have the most systems that are projected to be shallowly inundated in the next century or so. Going along with this, these are the soil types that those permitted systems, that 30,000 permitted systems, are actually been permitted to be put into. And why is this important? So we not only spatially want to know where should we put our effort as far as research, maybe in Currituck County, but what type of soils are most representative of these coastal septic systems in the state. And so when you do this analysis, you find that the vast majority, over 61% of all permitted systems, are in altisols. So these are clay-rich subsoil type soils on the coast. So very common in altisols, and then the other is entisols. These are our sandy soils. And this makes sense because these are typically our higher elevation areas on the coast. And so our higher elevation areas have more septic systems permitted to go into those areas. The big thing here as well, when we look at the soil data, we can separate the soil data into drainage class. So well drained, somewhat excessively drained, moderately well drained, somewhat poorly drained, very poorly drained. And then there were certain septic systems that were permitted in areas that we had unknown data from the soil survey. I color coded these. Green is good. So these have abundant vertical separation between the water table, or predicted vertical separation between the water table and where the drain field would be. Yellow is sort of intermediate, and then red, these are soil types that have likely been drained and filled in the past, so that it may not line up with the natural drainage class, but these are the most at-risk systems. And as you can see, there's like over 8,000 systems that are in these poorly drained, very poorly drained. What does that mean? It means the water table is predicted to be less than 30 centimeters from the soil surface, or 1 foot. So these have a very shallow separation distance to begin with vertically. And with sea level rise and groundwater tables coming up, that vertical separation distance from the bottom of the system is being eaten up as well. And so we see this in many of our coastal areas as well. So we have 8,000 systems that are really high risk right now, I would say, that should probably get looked at as far as like what are the soil composition at some of these sites, and is the functionality of the system actually protecting water quality, and then even in these systems, they may have been permitted decades ago. And so, 30, 40 years of groundwater rise, you may be having that vertical separation distance being encroached upon by rising groundwater tables, even in systems that are predicted from soil survey to be okay. So really, what do we have here? We have a nice suite of information for 7 counties on septic system risk from sea level rise, what soils are they in, and what is the drainage class or predicted vertical separation between that system and where the water table should be. This really can inform field data or field data collection, which is very expensive, time consuming, etc. So the take-home message is in the 7 counties that we've looked at, Currituck is the most at risk, therefore should likely be targeted for further research in the field. What types of soils should be targeted? Altisols, entisols. The sandy soils are clay subsoils, typically pretty well drained in these systems. And then maybe looking at some of these systems that were permitted in the past and these soil types that are predicted to have shallow water tables would be important as well. So really the big thing here is we need a lot of field research in the state to really understand the functionality and what's going on in these permitted systems that have been there in fixed positions as around them sea level rise is coming in. So we have vertical issues, we have our setback issues, geospatial issues. We need to really get out in the field and start looking at on the ground what's going on with the functionality of these older systems, in particular in our coastal environment in North Carolina. So I don't know, been rambling for a while here. I know Eric gave me an hour, so I'm going to wrap this up. But conclusions: saltwater intrusions occurring all over North Carolina. It's not going away. The projections are exponential. They're increasing through 2100. We're going to see 1 to 3 feet of sea level rise likely in the next century. This is going to have major impacts to our soil systems, our infrastructure, our agricultural systems, and our wetland systems as well in the coast. So what are we seeing? Massive erosion of our wetland buffers. It's decreasing the protected area. This area that's protecting our infrastructure behind there is shrinking. Septic systems in low-lying areas will become inundated by 2100. Just from 7 counties, we're seeing hundreds of systems predicted to be underwater by 2100. So we need further planning, research for coastal resilience in the state to prevent water quality degradation and disease from failing septic systems on the coast. And from there, we just need to move forward and get some more research dollars to really understand what's going on the ground, at the ground level on these permitted systems, and what are the alternatives, knowing what we know is going to occur in the future with salinization. What are our alternative systems that we should really be pushing in these coastal areas for new developments as well? Here's the question slides. Unfortunately, not available to answer questions right now, but you can shoot me an email at my NC State email if you have a specific question or comment. And if you're interested in what we're doing day to day, you can check us out on Twitter. My handle is MuckDragon. Makes sense since we work so much in these organic soils and wetland buffers. And here's me in one in Washington County. So appreciate the time. And that's some of the things we're doing with soils, septic systems, and salinization relative to sea level rise in North Carolina. Thanks.